The clinking of silverware echoed through the dimly lit dining room, a soundtrack to my unraveling world. I sat there, Grace Hartley, 58 years old, divorced and invisible, staring at the roast beef I'd slaved over for hours. My father Richard leaned back in his chair, his face twisted in that familiar sneer. Grace, honestly, what have you ever done? Useless as always. He barked his words, slicing through the air like a knife. My mother Diane nodded with a pitying smile, while my sister Caroline let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the walls. My brother just shoveled food, indifferent as ever. They treated me like I wasn't even there, a ghost in my own family home. I'd spent decades sacrificing raising them up, biting my tongue through their betrayals, watching them thrive on my silence. But that night, something snapped. No tears, no outburst. Just a cold, calculating calm washing over me as I met their eyes. They laughed harder, oblivious to the storm brewing in the quietest corner of the table. They had no idea I held the threads to their perfect little lives' debts, hidden marriages, crumbling secrets rotting beneath the surface. And I was done being merciful. What happened next, I didn't scream or storm out. Instead, I plotted. A mysterious inheritance, a web of revelations, and a revenge so precise it shattered their world piece by piece. Stick around, because this isn't just a story of humiliation. It's a tale of shocking twists, where the underestimated rise, the mighty fall, and justice taste sweeter than any family dinner. By the end, you'll cheer for the ultimate payoff that left them begging, and me finally free. You won't believe how it unfolds. My name is Grace Hartley. I'm 58 years old, a retired bookkeeper who spent 35 years balancing other people's numbers, while my own life quietly slipped out of balance. I live alone in a small brick house on the edge of Maplewood, Ohio, the same town where I was born, raised 4 ungrateful souls under one roof, and eventually watched my marriage die a slow death. I'm divorced now, independent by necessity, and for the most part, I like the quiet. Most days, anyway. That all changed on a chilly Sunday in early October when I agreed against my better judgment to host the family dinner. The dining room smelled of rosemary and slow-roasted beef the way it always did when I cooked for them. I had set the table with the good china, the one my mother insisted was only for special occasions, even though the occasion was simply that they had decided to grace me with their presence. The chandelier cast its familiar golden glow over the long oak table that once seated 6 every night, and now felt cavernous with only 5. My father, Richard Hartley, 81 and still convinced the world revolved around his opinions, sat at the head like a king on a cracked throne. My mother, Diane, 79, delicate as porcelain and twice as brittle, fluttered beside him. Caroline, my younger sister, 54, real estate queen of 3 counties, arrived in a cloud of Chanel and superiority. And then there was my brother Tommy, 56, who had never held a steady job longer than 18 months, yet somehow always had a new truck in the driveway, courtesy of Dad's dwindling savings. I carried in the platter myself because no one ever offered to help. The conversation had already started without me as usual. "Grace, this looks adequate," Caroline said, inspecting the roast as though it might bite her. "You really should let a caterer handle these things. It's 2025, not 1955. Tommy snorted into his iced tea. "Yeah, sis, you work too hard for people who don't appreciate it." I forced a smile and took my seat at the far end, the same chair I'd occupied since I was 12. The one closest to the kitchen, naturally. Dad carved the meat with theatrical precision, the way he used to carve the Thanksgiving turkey when we were kids, back when he still pretended to be proud of all of us. He passed the first slice to Tommy, the second to Caroline, the third to Mom. By the time the platter reached me, only fatty edges remained. That should have been my warning. The talk drifted as it always did to Caroline's latest lake house closing, and Tommy's brilliant new idea for a food truck empire that would of course require seed money. Mom cooed over both of them the way she had since we were small, her eyes shining with the same selective pride she'd perfected decades ago. And then Dad set his fork down with a deliberate clink. Speaking of money, he said, his gaze sliding over me like I was part of the furniture. "We need to have a serious family discussion soon. About the estate. About what happens when your mother and I are gone. Mom nodded solemnly. Caroline straightened, scenting inheritance the way a shark scents blood. I stayed quiet, slicing my meat into smaller and smaller pieces. Dad continued louder now, as though volume made the words kinder. Some people in this family have contributed. Built something. Others. He let the word hang in the air like smoke. Others have just taken up space. Caroline's lips curved into that small, satisfied smile she'd worn since childhood, whenever I was about to be diminished. Dad, she said sweetly, we all know Grace has had a hard time. The divorce, the dead-end jobs. It's not her fault she never amounted to much, Tommy chuckled. Yeah, Grace. No offense, but you're kind of the cautionary tale in the Hartley success story. I felt the old sting rise in my throat, the one I'd swallowed 1,000 times before. I waited for it to burn, to choke me the way it always had. But tonight it didn't come. Dad leaned forward, his eyes hard. Let's be honest, Grace. You've been useless to this family for years. Always on the outside looking in. Maybe it's time you accept that and stop expecting handouts when we're gone. Mom reached over and patted his hand in agreement, as if he'd just offered sage wisdom instead of a public execution. Caroline lifted her glass in a mock toast. To clarity, she said and drank. The room tilted for the moment. Sound muffled, colors too bright. I looked from face to face. These people who shared my blood, my history, my childhood home, and I searched for the pain I knew should be there. There was none. Only a vast, icy stillness spreading through my chest like frost on glass. I set my fork down without a sound. My hands didn't shake. My eyes didn't fill. I simply looked at each of them. Really looked for the first time in years. Dad frowned, sensing something off but unable to name it. Mom's smile faltered. Caroline's smirk wavered. Even Tommy paused mid-chew. I said nothing. I didn't need to. Because for the first time in my life, I felt nothing. And that scared them, they just didn't know it yet. I sat there long after the last plate had been cleared, the chandeliers still glowing, the house unnaturally quiet now that their laughter had died away. The silence pressed against my ears like water, thick and heavy. And in that stillness, something inside me finally settled into place. For the first time in my life, I felt nothing, and that scared them, they just didn't know it yet. I have always been the quiet one. Not shy, not timid, just quiet. The kind of quiet that lets the world forget you're in the room, the kind that teaches you to listen when no one thinks you're worth speaking to. It started long before that dinner, long before any of them could imagine I might one day hold their futures in my hands. When I was 7, I came home from school clutching a gold star the teacher had pressed onto my spelling test. I ran straight to the kitchen where Mom was rolling pie crust and Dad was reading the newspaper. I held it up, chest puffed with pride. Mom glanced down, smiled the way you smile at a neighbor's child, and said, "That's nice, honey. Now go find Caroline. She just got chosen for the gifted program. We're having cake to celebrate." Dad never even looked up from the stock listings. That was the first time I understood that my victories were only ever background noise to someone else's triumph. By 10, I had learned the rules perfectly. Caroline wanted the blue bicycle with the streamers. I got the hand-me-down red one with the bent wheel. Tommy broke the living room lamp roughhousing. I was the one who spent my allowance on a replacement so he wouldn't get grounded before the big game. Teachers praised my grades, my neat handwriting, my helpfulness, but at home, those things were simply expected of the child who wouldn't amount to much anyway. Dad said it openly once when I was 12, and asked why Caroline got piano lessons and I didn't. We invest where we see potential grace. You're steady, reliable, but you're not the one who's going to shine. Mom nodded as she folded laundry. Exactly. You're our quiet one. That's a gift in itself. I smiled, said thank you, and went to my room to memorize the encyclopedia because no one was paying for my lessons. High school was more of the same. I graduated valedictorian, gave a speech no one in my family bothered to attend because Caroline had a cheerleading banquet the same night. College acceptances came thick in the mail. I tucked them under my mattress and took the full-time bookkeeping job at the local factory so Caroline could go to Northwestern and Tommy could find himself at community college for the 3rd time. I told myself it was love. I told myself families take care of each other. I told myself a lot of things that kept the hurt from spilling over. Then came Mark. He was kind, steady an accountant from the next town over. We married when I was 24, bought a little house with the money I'd saved from every overtime shift. For a while, it felt like I had finally stepped out of the shadow. We talked about children, about traveling once the mortgage was paid down. My family came to the wedding, of course. Dad shook Mark's hand and said, "Take good care of her. She's a good worker, our Grace, even if she'll never set the world on fire." Mom added, "She's always been the dependable type. You won't have to worry about big dreams getting in the way." Caroline laughed and told Mark he was lucky to get someone so low maintenance. I laughed along because that's what the quiet one does. The erosion was slow the way water wears stone. Sunday dinners at my parents' house became battlegrounds of comparison. Caroline's new promotion, Tommy's latest get-rich scheme, my mother's endless pride in both of them. Mark started listening. Really listening. After 5 years, he stopped talking about children. After 10, he stopped planning vacations. After 15, he looked at me across the breakfast table and said, "Your dad's right, Grace. You never wanted more than this, did you?" I asked what he meant. He sighed, tired, like I was the one exhausting him. "You're content with ordinary." I thought I could be too, but I can't. I need someone who dreams bigger. I reminded him the house was half mine. The savings were half mine. The life was half mine. He looked almost relieved. "See? That's exactly it. You think in halves. Safe. Small." He left 6 months before our 25th anniversary. The papers cited irreconcilable differences. My family sent a sympathy card that read, "We always knew you'd struggle to keep a man like Mark happy." Caroline added a post-it call if you need help packing. I know people who move houses for cheap. I didn't cry then either. I signed the papers, sold. The house moved into the little brick place on Elm Street and kept balancing books for small businesses around town. I smiled when people asked how I was. I sent birthday cards. I showed up to holidays with casseroles no one thanked me for. And all the while, I watched. I watched the way my father's hands shook when he thought no one noticed. I watched Caroline's perfect smile freeze when her husband's phone buzzed. I watched Tommy count on tomorrow's bailout the way other people count on sunrise. Being invisible teaches you things. You learn which drawers hold the real bank statements, which lies are repeated often enough to sound like truth. You learn the exact pitch of a voice that's pretending everything is fine. You learn how to store information the way other people store grudges, quietly, carefully, without a single outward ripple. That night, sitting at the table long after they had gone home, stuffed and smug, I understood something with perfect clarity. Every time they dismissed me, every time they handed my future to someone else, they were forging the weapon they would one day face. Because the quiet one sees everything. The quiet one remembers. The quiet one waits. They mistook silence for weakness. They were about to learn the difference. They mistook silence for weakness. They were about to learn the difference. In the weeks that followed the dinner, I did what I had always done. I watched. Only now I watched with purpose. The house on Elm Street had become my quiet command center. From the small upstairs window, I could see half the town, but more importantly, I could see the threads that held my family's perfect picture together. Threads that were already fraying long before I decided to pull. Dad's company, Hartley & Sons Construction, had been the pride of 3 counties when I was a girl. Orange hard hats with the company logo used to line the hallway like trophies. Now the office on Main Street had a permanent for lease sign leaning against the window. Though Dad still drove there every morning in his aging Cadillac, pretending the world hadn't noticed the gates were padlocked. I noticed. I noticed the way his mail piled up unopened, the way collection notices were slipped discreetly into the side pocket of his briefcase, instead of the trash where they belonged. I noticed because I still picked up his dry cleaning every Thursday, a habit he never bothered to break me of. The girl at the cleaners, Marisol, had started whispering apologies when she handed me the ticket. "Tell your dad the bank manager was in again." She'd say, eyes soft with pity. Dad was 6 figures behind on equipment leases alone. Suppliers had stopped extending credit. The new housing development he kept bragging about at family gatherings existed only on a glossy brochure that was already 2 years out of date. He was one missed payroll away from the whole thing collapsing. Yet every Sunday he sat at the head of the table talking about expansion opportunities, like a man describing a winning hand while the table was already on fire. Mom knew pieces of it, of course. She had always known pieces. What she didn't know, what she refused to know, was how deep the hole had become. Every month on the 15th, she still drove to the bank to deposit her Social Security check into the joint account she called our nest egg. She still clipped coupons and bragged to her garden club friends about the cruise she and Dad were finally going to take once the company quiets down. What she didn't realize was that the nest egg had been bleeding out for over 3 years. Dad had added himself as sole signatory on her IRA rollover 6 months after his first big project went bust. The statements still came to the house, but they came addressed to him now, and Mom trusting soul that she was never questioned why she no longer saw them. I knew because I still helped her sort the mail when I visited, and I recognized the brokerage logo. I knew because I had balanced enough books in my life to spot the pattern 1,000 here, 5,000 there, always rounded to look like fees or taxes. By my rough count, more than $300,000 had vanished into Hartley & Sons' black hole. Mom's retirement, the one she had pinched and saved for since she was 35, was keeping up appearances for a company that had already died. She smiled at garden club-served lemonade on the veranda and had no idea she was one market dip away from choosing between groceries and her blood pressure pills. And then there was Caroline. Caroline, who posted sun-drenched photos of charity galas and lakeside sunsets, who still got her hair highlighted every 5 weeks at the salon that cost more per visit than most people made in a day. Caroline, whose husband Edward had stopped appearing in those photos months ago. I noticed because I followed her on Instagram the way intelligence agencies follow dissidents quietly, thoroughly, and without ever liking a single post. The comments from her society friends had shifted from heart emojis to careful variations of thinking of you and here if you need anything. Edward's golf clubs no longer leaned against the mudroom wall when I dropped off Mom's casseroles. His Rolex no longer flashed on the wrist that used to rest possessively on Caroline's shoulder at every family event. The whispers at the country club were growing louder. Separate bedrooms, separate vacations, separate lawyers. Caroline had built her entire identity on being the Hartley who married well, who hosted the best fundraisers, who never had to worry about money the way the rest of us supposedly did. If the divorce went public, and it would because Edward's new girlfriend was 29 and impatient, Caroline wouldn't just lose the lake house and the Mercedes. She would lose the invitations, the board positions, the whispered title of most admired woman in the county. She would become the cautionary tale she had always accused me of being. I watched all of it from the sidelines, the same place they had kept me my whole life. I watched Dad refill his scotch with a hand that trembled just enough to betray him. I watched Mom rearrange the same silk flowers for the 3rd time, because she couldn't bear to look at the stack of unopened envelopes. I watched Caroline refresh her phone 12 times an hour, waiting for a text that would never come. They smiled for the Christmas card photo that year, all of them crammed onto the same velvet sofa in front of the same artificial tree. Dad's arm around Mom. Caroline's practiced grin. Tommy photobombed in the back like nothing had changed. The photographer airbrushed the exhaustion from their eyes and sent the proofs to Mom with a note that said, "What a beautiful family." Mom ordered 500 cards. She still believed in the picture. Behind every perfect family photo, something was rotting. And while they crumbled, a call changed everything for me. Behind every perfect family photo, something was rotting. And while they crumbled, a call changed everything for me. It came on a Tuesday morning in late November, the kind of gray day when the sky presses low and the house feels too quiet. I was at the kitchen table reconciling a client's receipts when the landline rang, an actual ring, not the chirp of my cell. No one used the landline anymore except telemarketers and apparently fate. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, Midwestern, polite. Mrs. Grace Hartley. This is Daniel Whitcomb of Whitcomb and Associates in Chicago. I'm handling the estate of Eleanor Margaret Grayson. I believe you knew her as Ellie. Ellie. The name hit me like warm water poured over frozen hands. Ellie Grayson had been a thin, nervous girl who worked the front desk at the clinic where I temped for 6 months back in 2001. She was 23, then pregnant, terrified, and completely alone. Her own family had thrown her out the moment the test turned positive. Her father called her a disgrace her mother wouldn't take her calls. Ellie slept in her car for 2 weeks until the shelter had an opening. I found her crying in the break room one afternoon, clutching a paper cup of tea gone cold. I didn't have much, but I had an empty spare room and a stubborn belief that no one should have to choose between a baby and a roof. I took her home. For 7 months she lived with me, folded tiny onesies on my couch, ate my slightly burned lasagna, and slowly learned how to breathe again. When her son was born, I cut the cord myself because the nurse was busy, and Ellie reached for my hand first. 3 weeks later, she moved to Chicago with a cousin who finally came around. We exchanged Christmas cards for a few years, then life happened and the cards slowed. The last one I received was a photo of a smiling boy in a graduation cap, 2018. I kept it tucked in my Bible. Ellie passed away in September. Mr. Whitcomb continued gently. Ovarian cancer. She was only 47. I'm sorry if this is a shock. It was and it wasn't. Time has a way of making even the closest people feel distant. I gripped the phone tighter. How can I help? There was a soft rustle of papers. Mrs. Grayson left very specific instructions. She named you as the primary beneficiary of her estate. The total value after taxes and fees comes to just over $8 million in liquid assets, plus a small commercial property in Evanston, and a trust that has been quietly growing since 2009. I sat down hard on the kitchen chair. The numbers didn't compute. Ellie had been a receptionist, then a single mother. $8 million didn't just appear. Mrs. Hartley, are you still there? I'm here, I managed. There must be some mistake. Ellie had a son. Benjamin is provided for. Separately, he said. Ellie was quite clear. Everything else is yours. She left a letter she asked me to read to you personally when the time came. He cleared his throat and began. Grace, if you're hearing this, I'm already gone, and I hope I lived long enough to make you proud. You saved my life twice, once when you gave me a room, and again when you showed me that kindness doesn't need a reason. After Ben was born, I got a job at a little tech startup. I was just answering phones, but I listened, I learned, and when they offered stock options to everyone, I took them because you once told me to always say yes to a future I couldn't yet see. That company went public in 2015. I never told anyone how much it was worth because money felt like something that might jinx the luck you gave me. I watched you from afar all these years. I saw how your family treated you at that awful reunion in 2012. Yes, I was there, 2 tables over, too scared to say hello. I saw the way they talked over you, through you, about you. I wanted to stand up and scream that they were blind, that the strongest person in the room was the one they kept trying to erase. I never forgot what you did for me when no one else would. You were the only person in my entire life who chose me when choosing me cost you something. So now I choose you back. Use this money to build the life they said you couldn't have. Be loud if you want to be. Be quiet if that still feels like home. Just be Grace, the Grace who saved a scared girl and never asked for anything in return. You were never ordinary. You were the safe place the rest of us ran to when the world got cruel. Thank you for teaching me that one act of decency can echo for decades. I hope this echoes back to you. With all my love, Ellie. By the time Mr. Whitcomb finished, my cheeks were wet, and my throat ached with the kind of tears that come from being seen, truly seen for the first time in decades. Ellie, little Ellie, who used to fall asleep on my couch clutching a teddy bear someone had abandoned at the clinic, had watched me, remembered me, chosen me when no one else ever had. For the first time in decades, someone chose me. For the first time in decades, someone chose me. The words from Ellie's letter stayed with me like a low, steady flame. I read them again and again until they were carved into my thoughts. $8 million, a commercial building, and a trust that would keep growing. It was more money than I had ever imagined touching, but the real gift was the power it gave me. The power to stop being the one who waited and start being the one who moved. I did not rush. Rushing is what loud people do. I had spent a lifetime perfecting patience, and now I put it to work. The first call I made was to Daniel Whitcomb himself. I asked him to recommend the most discreet, most ruthless professionals he knew. Within a week, I had retained 3 separate teams, a white shoe law firm in Cleveland that specialized in corporate takeovers, a forensic accounting group out of Pittsburgh that had unraveled 2 Ponzi schemes in the last 5 years, and a private investigation outfit run by a retired FBI agent who still owed Ellie a favor from the old days. I paid their retainers from the first disbursement of the trust, wired quietly through a newly formed LLC named only with a string of numbers. No one in Maplewood would ever connect the dots back to Grace Hartley. I gave them simple instructions. Find everything there is to find about Richard Hartley, Diane Hartley, Caroline Langford. She had taken Edward's last name when it was convenient, and for good measure, my brother Tommy. I wanted financials, tax returns, emails, text messages, medical records, club memberships, parking tickets, anything that could be obtained legally, and a few things that lived in the gray. I wanted leverage. They delivered. Dad's company was worse than I had guessed. The forensic accountants traced a daisy chain of shell entities he had used to siphon construction loans into personal accounts. He had been paying himself consulting fees on projects that never broke ground. 2 of the banks were already preparing quiet foreclosure notices. One more missed payment, and the dominoes would fall. There was also a very convenient paper trail showing that he had moved the family home out of Mom's name and into a trust controlled solely by him and Tommy, a move clearly designed to keep it away from me and, ironically, from creditors. Mom's retirement fund was almost empty. The auditors produced monthly statements showing transfers of exactly $9,800, always just under the $10,000 threshold that triggers federal reporting. The money had been routed through a dormant Hartley & Sons account, and then vanished into a gambling site registered in Curacao. Dad had apparently discovered online poker during the pandemic and never quite stopped. Caroline's house of cards was the most elaborate. Edward had been moving assets into his own irrevocable trust for 18 months, preparing for the divorce he hadn't yet filed. Caroline, desperate to keep up appearances, had taken out a second mortgage on the lake house and was 3 payments behind. The country club had sent final notices for unpaid dues. Her name was already circulating on a whispered, do-not-seat list among the older members. And then, there was the offshore account in the Caymans she thought no one knew about, 6 figures skimmed from real estate commissions, hidden through a series of cashback closings. The accountants flagged it for potential tax fraud. One anonymous tip to the IRS, and she would owe penalties that would swallow her whole. I kept everything in a locked fire safe in the spare bedroom, color-coded folders, encrypted flash drives, printed summaries in my own neat handwriting. Each night I sat at the little desk under the eaves and added new pages to the master document I had titled simply Sequence. It was a timetable precise and merciless. Richard first acquire controlling interest through the shell companies, force the board vote, watch him lose the only thing he ever cared about. Diane second present her with the evidence of the emptied retirement account the same week the cruise brochures arrived, let her choose between loyalty to him and survival. Caroline third leak, just enough about Edward's trust to her biggest gossip of a client, then sit back while the country club vultures finished the job, one by one. No grand announcements, no dramatic confrontations yet. Just pressure applied at exactly the right points, like turning a dial until something inside quietly snaps. I slept better than I'd had in years. The house on Elm Street no longer felt small. It felt like a blind, the kind hunters build in the woods, camouflaged and perfectly still. Every piece of information that arrived was another bullet loaded, another sight adjustment on the rifle. I was in no hurry. I had waited 58 years for the life I was supposed to have. A few more months would make the moment they realized who was holding the trigger all the sweeter. The hunter waits, and I had waited my whole life. The hunter waits, and I had waited my whole life. By early February, the ground was still iron hard, and the air carried that particular Midwest bite that finds every gap in a coat. I pulled into my parents' driveway in my sensible gray Camry carrying a homemade apple pie, and a smile I had practiced in the rearview mirror until it looked soft, apologetic, exactly the smile they expected from the old Grace. Mom opened the door before I could knock, her face lighting up with the small triumph of believing I had finally come crawling back. "Grace, sweetheart, look at you out in this weather." She pulled me inside, hugging me too tightly the way people do when they want to feel generous. Dad was already in his recliner, newspaper spread like a shield, but he glanced up long enough to nod. Caroline was there too, unexpectedly perched on the sofa in cream cashmere legs, crossed, scrolling her phone with the bored elegance of someone who had somewhere better to be. I handed Mom the pie. "I've been thinking about what happened at dinner," I began. Voice, small eyes lowered just enough. "I was quiet because I didn't want to make things worse. But I miss you all. I don't want to be on the outside anymore." Mom made the soft cooing sound she reserved for injured birds and wayward daughters. "Oh, honey, we were too harsh. Come sit, we'll have coffee." Dad grunted something that might have been welcome. Caroline looked up long enough to give me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Miracles do happen," she murmured, but patted the cushion beside her anyway. I sat. I folded my hands in my lap. I became the Grace they remembered, eager to please, quick to apologize, slow to notice when the conversation turned to sharper things. They relaxed almost immediately. Shoulders dropped. Voices rose. The pie was praised and sliced, and within 20 minutes the room felt exactly like it always had. Except now I was the one steering the current with the gentlest of questions. I asked Dad how the new development was coming along. He puffed up, launched into a story about permits and investors that I already knew was fiction. I nodded in all the right places, eyes wide with admiration. I asked Mom whether she had booked the Alaska cruise yet. She laughed a little too brightly and said soon, very soon. I asked Caroline if she and Edward were planning their usual Valentine's getaway to Aspen. She waved a manicured hand and changed the subject to the club's upcoming charity auction, but not before I caught the flicker of panic. Coffee turned into a second slice of pie, and the conversation drifted as it always did to money. Dad complained about property taxes. Caroline sighed about the rising cost of everything. And then Mom, warmed by sugar and the pleasure of having her quiet daughter back in the fold, leaned over to pat my knee. "You know, Grace, your father and I have been talking to the estate attorney again. We want to simplify things. Caroline and Tommy have families to think of, responsibilities. We've decided to put the house and the remaining land into a trust that skips a generation, goes straight to the grandchildren eventually. Less complicated that way. You understand, don't you? You've never been one to fuss about money." The room stilled for half a heartbeat. Dad cleared his throat, suddenly interested in the pie crust. Caroline's lips curved in satisfaction she didn't bother to hide. I let my eyes fill just enough. "Oh," I said softly. "I understand completely. You have to do what's fair for the children." Mom beamed, relieved. "Exactly. We knew you'd see it that way. You've always been so reasonable." Caroline reached over and squeezed my hand, a rare gesture that felt like victory to her. "It's not personal, Gracie. It's just practical." I nodded. Humble, grateful, the perfect defeated daughter. Inside, something cold and bright clicked into place. They kept talking, words spilling faster now that they believed the last obstacle had agreed to be removed. Dad mentioned the attorney's name, the one who had drafted the new documents. Caroline let slip the date of the signing next Thursday because everything will be finalized before the bank gets nosy. Mom even bragged that the trust was structured so that certain people can't contest it no matter what. I absorbed every detail, every careless syllable, while I smiled and refilled their coffee cups and told them how proud I was to be part of such a thoughtful family. When I left 2 hours later, cheeks sore from smiling, Mom hugged me again at the door. "This is how it should be," she whispered. "All of us together." I hugged her back, gentle, meek, harmless. And just like that, they handed me the knife. And just like that, they handed me the knife. I wasted no time. The following Monday morning, before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops of Maplewood, 3 separate limited liability companies registered in Delaware, funded through the Evanston Property Trust, and layered behind nominee directors began quietly purchasing distressed debt and minority shares of Hartley & Sons Construction. The sellers were banks eager to unload non-performing loans and a handful of retired subcontractors who still held old stock certificates they had long ago written off. By Wednesday afternoon, my entities controlled 54% of the voting shares and 72% of the secured debt. Dad never saw it coming because the buyer on every document was listed as H&S Acquisition Group or Buckeye Holdings LLC, names that meant nothing to him. While the purchases moved forward, the forensic team delivered the final package, a leather-bound report, thick enough to stun a horse. Inside were canceled checks Dad had signed to himself, phony invoices from companies that shared his golf buddy's home address, and a series of wire transfers to an offshore account that matched the exact amounts missing from Mom's retirement statements. The crown jewel was an email chain from 18 months earlier, in which Dad instructed the corporate attorney to draft a new shareholder agreement that would strip voting rights from any heir who has not materially contributed to the ongoing success of the enterprise, language clearly aimed at me. The attorney had pushed back, citing fiduciary duty, so Dad had simply fired him and found someone hungrier. But the twist that made me smile in the dark was buried in an appendix labeled Related Party Transactions. 6 weeks after that humiliating October dinner, Dad had quietly executed a series of quitclaim deeds and trust amendments, transferring the remaining undeveloped land parcels over 200 acres along the river that the family had always called our legacy into a revocable trust, naming Tommy as sole trustee and beneficiary. My name had been scratched out with a single black line as if I had never existed. The notary was the same woman who used to bring cookies to Little League games when Tommy played. She stamped it without question because Richard Hartley's signature still opened every door in 3 counties. I scheduled the emergency board meeting for a Friday, the one day Dad still drove to the empty office to keep an eye on things. My attorney, a silver-haired woman named Ruth Caldwell, who looked like someone's favorite aunt and argued like a shark, sent the notice via courier. It simply read, "Special meeting of shareholders to consider removal of current officers and election of new directors." Dad assumed it was another bank ambush and arrived early, briefcase in hand, ready to bluff. There were only 5 of us in the fluorescent-lit conference room that smelled of mildew and old coffee. Dad, the 2 remaining loyal foremen who still held a few shares, each Ruth and me. I wore a navy skirt suit I had bought for the occasion. Hair twisted back, no jewelry except the plain gold watch I'd worn since 1985. Dad didn't recognize me at first. He was busy shaking hands with the foreman, promising them the banks would come around. Ruth called the meeting to order. She introduced herself, then turned to me. "And representing the majority shareholder, Mrs. Grace Hartley." Dad's head snapped up. The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint. "Grace. What the hell is this?" Ruth slid the first folder across the table. Proxy statements confirming 54% ownership, fully executed and filed with the state. "We're here to accept your resignation, Mr. Hartley, or we can vote it through. Your choice." He opened the folder with shaking hands. Page after page of stock certificates, loan assignments, and transfer agreements, each one stamped and notarized. When he reached the final exhibit, the trust amendment gifting everything to Tommy, he made a sound like air escaping a punctured tire. "You can't," he rasped. "That land is for the family." "Which family?" I asked quietly. It was the first time I had spoken. "The one you erased with a pen stroke." The foreman shifted uncomfortably. Ruth laid out the fraud evidence next, just enough to make resignation the only door left open. Dad stared at the table for a long minute, then scrawled his name across the resignation letter Ruth had already prepared. He never looked at me again. As he stood to leave, Ruth handed him the certified copy of the new board resolution. At the bottom in bold was the new registered agent for service of process, Grace Margaret Hartley. His face when he saw my name on the documents was worth every year of silence. His face when he saw my name on the documents was worth every year of silence. I gave Mom 10 days. 10 days to watch Dad come home earlier each evening, to notice the Cadillac stayed in the garage, to feel the house grow quieter as the phone stopped ringing with suppliers and old friends. 10 days was long enough for the new reality to settle on her shoulders like dust she couldn't quite brush away. On the 11th morning, I drove over unannounced, carrying only a slim leather portfolio and the kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly how the conversation will end. She met me at the door in her pale blue robe, hair still in curlers, eyes puffy from another night of listening to Dad pace the hallway. "Grace," she said, surprise softening into relief. "Come in, honey. Your father's resting. He's been so tired." I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The house smelled of yesterday's coffee and the lavender sachets she still tucked into every drawer. I followed her into the sunroom, where the African violets lined the windowsill like silent witnesses. We sat on the wicker love seat. I opened the portfolio and laid the first stack of statements on the coffee table between us. Bank records, transfer confirmations, brokerage summaries, each page flagged with colored tabs. "Mom," I said gently, "these are your retirement accounts." She leaned forward, squinting at the numbers. "I don't understand. Richard handles all that." "I know he does." I turned to the page I had marked with a single red paperclip. "This is the balance from 3 years ago. $872,000. And this," I flipped to the final statement, "is what's left today. $41,812. Her hand fluttered to her throat. "There must be some mistake." "There isn't." I laid the wire transfer logs beside the statements. Every withdrawal bore Richard Hartley's electronic signature, routed through Hartley & Sons, then vanished into accounts that paid credit card bills, country club dues, and a string of online gambling sites. He started small. Then the company loans came due, and the bank stopped calling him back. Your money kept the lights on longer than anyone knew. Mom's lips parted, but no sound came. The color drained from her face the way water drains from a glass tipped too far. She stared at the pages as if they were written in a language she had once known but forgotten. "He promised me," she whispered finally. "He sat right here last Christmas and promised the cruise was booked for September. He said everything was fine." I waited. I had learned the power of waiting. She reached for the papers with trembling fingers, turning them as though the numbers might rearrange themselves into something kinder. When they didn't, her shoulders folded inward, and she began to cry. Not the delicate tears of a woman who expects comfort, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone whose entire world has cracked open. "I trusted him," she choked. "I trusted him with everything. My savings, my future, my heart. How could he do this to me after 59 years? I let her cry until the storm passed into hiccups and exhausted silence. Then I spoke soft but unyielding. "I can stop the bleeding, Mom. I can move what's left into an account only you control. I can make sure you never have to choose between medicine and groceries. But first, I need something from you." She lifted her head, eyes swollen, desperate for any lifeline. "I need you to say it." I continued. "All of it. Out loud. Every time you chose them over me. Every birthday you forgot because Caroline had a recital. Every college fund that went to her tuition while I worked double shifts. Every Christmas you handed me a gift card and told me I didn't need anything fancy because I wasn't fancy. Every time you watched Dad call me useless and said nothing. I need you to look me in the eye and tell me you see it now." The words hung between us like frost. She opened her mouth, closed, it opened it again. "I didn't mean," she started. "Say it." She folded in half forehead, touching her knees, and the confession came in broken pieces. "I was wrong. I was so wrong. I let him decide who mattered. I let them hurt you because it was easier than fighting. I told myself you were strong enough to take it. I was a coward, Grace. I was a coward, and I'm sorry." The apology trembled in the air, fragile as the violets on the sill. For the first time, she said, "I'm sorry," but it wasn't nearly enough. For the first time, she said, "I'm sorry," but it wasn't nearly enough. I left Mom sitting among the scattered papers and the wilted violets, her apology still ringing hollow in my ears. Some debts cannot be settled with words. Caroline's was next. The private investigator had delivered the file on Edward 2 weeks earlier. Thick, clinical, merciless. For 4 years, he had kept an apartment in Columbus under the name of his college roommate. The woman who shared it was 31, blonde, ambitious, and very patient. There were restaurant receipts, hotel key cards, a joint checking account he had opened for her, even a lease on a Lexus registered in her name. The photographs were crisp Edward's hand on the small of her back at a charity gala, the two of them laughing over brunch at a place Caroline herself had once Instagrammed as our favorite weekend spot. The investigator had also pulled Edward's text messages, an expense I never blinked at. They read like love letters written by a man who had already left the marriage in every way but paperwork. I did not send the file to Caroline. I did not call. I simply waited. The first crack appeared at the country club's annual spring luncheon. Caroline was chairwoman that year, desperate to prove she still belonged at the top. I attended as a guest of one of Mom's old garden club friends, quiet, unnoticed, sipping iced tea in the corner. Caroline floated from table to table in pale pink silk. Smile bright voice pitched to Carrie. Halfway through dessert, her phone buzzed on the table beside her untouched salad. She glanced at the screen, and I watched the color drain from her face. The message was from me. One line, no explanation. Ask Edward about the apartment on High Street. She excused herself, heels clicking too fast across the marble floor. From my seat, I could see her through the glass doors, pacing the veranda, phone pressed to her ear. Edward must have denied it at first. Caroline's gestures grew sharp, frantic. 10 minutes later, she stormed back inside, eyes glassy mascara smudged, and announced to the entire room that she had a migraine and needed to leave early. The women clucked in sympathy, but the whispers started before her Mercedes cleared the parking lot. That night, she began calling everyone she knew, demanding answers, threatening lawyers, unraveling in real time. Each frantic call fed the next rumor. By morning, the story had mutated. Edward was leaving her for his secretary, for a stripper. For a man, depending on who was telling it. Caroline showed up at the club the next day, determined to control the narrative, only to discover her key card had been deactivated, unpaid dues, the manager said with polite regret. She stood in the lobby screaming at a 19-year-old receptionist, while half the membership watched from the juice bar. Within a week, the invitations stopped arriving. The women who had once fought to sit at her table now looked through her in the grocery aisle. Her biggest client, the one who had bought 3 lake houses through her in 5 years, quietly moved to another broker. The charity boards she had chaired for a decade sent polite letters thanking her for her service and naming new chairwomen younger. Shinier, untainted by scandal, Caroline tried everything. She posted cryptic quotes about loyalty and betrayal. She showed up at luncheons, uninvited, smile-brittle voice too loud. She cornered mutual acquaintances in parking lots, demanding they choose sides. Each desperate performance only pushed her further to the edge of the circle she had spent her life ruling. I watched it all from a distance, the way you watch a house of cards collapse in slow motion. I never raised my voice. I never sent another text. I simply let her panic do the work I had planned for months. The final blow came at the club's Memorial Day brunch. Caroline arrived alone, dressed to kill, determined to reclaim her throne. Instead, she found her usual table occupied by the new charity chairwoman and Edward's girlfriend, blonde, glowing, wearing the diamond studs Caroline had bragged about buying him for their anniversary. Caroline stood frozen in the doorway for one endless second, then turned and walked out without a word. Someone recorded it on a phone. By evening, the video had been shared in every group chat she had once commanded. She called me that night, voice raw from screaming or crying or both. Grace, please. They're saying things that aren't true. You know these people. Tell them it isn't what they think. I let the silence stretch just long enough. Caroline, I said quietly, you taught me years ago that some people don't matter what happens to them. I'm only returning the lesson. She finally understood what being invisible feels like. She finally understood what being invisible feels like. I closed the phone after Caroline's broken plea and sat in the quiet of my little house. The kind of quiet that used to feel like punishment and now felt like armor. Spring had arrived outside the windows, tentative green, pushing through the soil. But inside, I was still turning over the pieces of a life I thought I had buried decades ago. A second envelope from Daniel Whitcomb arrived the following week, thicker than the first, sealed with the same discreet wax stamp. He had written a short note on heavy cream stationery. Ellie left instructions that this was to be delivered only after the initial estate matters were settled. She was very clear about timing. I carried it upstairs, locked the bedroom door, though I lived alone, and opened it with the same silver letter opener I had used for her first letter. Inside was another handwritten page in Ellie's careful, looping cursive. The ink slightly faded as though she had written it months before the cancer finally won. Grace, if you're reading this, you've started to fight back. Good. I knew you would. There's something I never told you. Something I carried alone because it wasn't my story to tell, until you were strong enough to hear it. You used to call her Lily. Remember the little girl they made you give up when you were 19? I was there that summer, Grace. I was the quiet maid of honor at Caroline's wedding, the one nobody noticed because I was only the caterer's niece filling in. I saw everything. I saw your mother lock the bedroom door while you cried so hard you couldn't breathe. I heard your father on the phone with the agency telling them the baby would be ready by Friday and not to use the family name. I watched them drive you to that place in Columbus the day after the reception, still in the pale blue dress you'd worn as bridesmaid. I never forgot the way you whispered her name when they took her from your arms. Years later, when my own Benjamin was born and I had money, I never expected I hired someone to look. It wasn't hard. The adoption was closed, but not airtight. I found her living in Seattle, bright, kind, fierce, everything you would have raised her to be. Her adoptive parents were good people. They gave her the world. But I sent anonymous scholarships for college, paid for music lessons. She never knew, came from a stranger, made sure she had what she needed when her adoptive father got sick. I watched her graduate summa cum laude, watched her open her pediatric practice, watched her marry a man who looks at her the way someone should have looked at you. Her name is Dr. Lily Margaret Hart now. She chose Hart herself when she turned 18 because her adoptive parents let her pick a middle name that felt like home. She doesn't know why yet. I'm leaving you everything you need to find her if you want to. There's a safety deposit key in the small velvet pouch, a birth certificate copy, a current address, even a photograph from last Christmas. She has your eyes, Grace, and your mouth when you're trying not to cry. I promised myself I would never force this on you. If you decide the past is better left alone, burn it all and live free. But if one day you're ready, she deserves to know the woman who loved her first, the woman who never stopped loving her even when the world demanded silence. You saved me once. Let me give you back the piece of your heart they stole. All my love, always, Ellie. My hands shook so hard the pages fluttered like trapped birds. I opened the velvet pouch, and the key slid out cold and heavy along with a single photograph. A woman in her late 30s, dark hair pulled back, smiling at a golden retriever on a sunny porch. She had my cheekbones, my slightly crooked front tooth, the same stubborn tilt of the chin I saw in the mirror every morning. I sat on the floor of the bedroom that had once been a nursery in my imagination, and cried the way I hadn't allowed myself to cry since the day they took her from me. Not bitter tears, not angry ones, just the deep cleansing kind that come when a wound you thought would scar forever suddenly finds air. I didn't call the number that night. I didn't write the letter that burned in my chest. Some doors you open gently, reverently when the time is exactly right. Lily was 39 years old, happy whole. She didn't need a ghost from a closed adoption crashing into her life because her long-lost mother suddenly had the courage. But one day she would know. One day when the last of the people who had hurt us both had felt the weight of what they did, I would walk up to her door with Ellie's letter in my hand and tell her the truth. That day would be my final card, the one no one could see coming. The one that would heal something in me deeper than any revenge. I slipped the photograph into the small silver frame that had sat empty on my dresser for 39 years and placed it where the morning light would find it first. I didn't just have money. I had a piece of my life stolen, and now it was returning. I didn't just have money. I had a piece of my life stolen, and now it was returning. For the first time in 58 years, I woke up each morning without the weight of someone else's expectations pressing on my chest. The photograph of Lily sat on my nightstand catching the first light, and I let it remind me that the future could still hold something soft. But before I reached for that future, I decided to build something for all the women who had been told, like me, that their stories ended at invisibility. I started the Lily Margaret Foundation in a modest storefront 2 blocks from the courthouse, the same street where women once lined up for welfare checks and now lined up for something else: hope. We offered small grants for housing deposits, vocational training, legal aid to fight predatory relatives, even emergency dental work, because I remembered how it felt to smile with a hand over your mouth. The first check I wrote was for a 62-year-old widow whose children had talked her into signing over her house for tax reasons. Within 6 months, we had helped 43 women keep roofs over their heads. Word traveled the way quiet things do in small towns, and soon the mailbox overflowed with handwritten letters addressed simply to Grace, the lady who understands. The local paper ran a Sunday feature titled "Second Act at 58: How One Maplewood Woman Turned Inheritance into Inspiration." The reporter, a young woman who reminded me of Lily at 20, sat at my kitchen table and listened while I told her not about the revenge, never that, only about the years of being the afterthought, the joy of waking up and deciding my own worth. The story went regional, then national. Morning shows called. A lifestyle magazine flew me to New York for a photo shoot in soft cream linen against a white backdrop, the headline reading, "Self-Made After 58, The Quiet Revolution of Grace Hartley." They loved the phrase so much it became a hashtag. Book clubs read the article aloud. Women sent photos of themselves holding signs that said, "I am Grace." I spoke at libraries, at senior centers, at a TEDx in Cleveland, where the audience rose before I finished. I never raised my voice. I never needed to. I simply told the truth that being overlooked can teach you how to see everyone else, that money is only a tool, and that starting over is not an indulgence, it is a human right. In Maplewood, the change was impossible to miss. The little brick house on Elm Street now had window boxes bursting with geraniums. A tasteful brass plaque by the foundation door read, "Lily Margaret House, a safe place to begin again." People waved when I walked to the coffee shop. Children asked for selfies. The mayor gave me a key to the city at a ceremony where half the garden club cried into their iced tea. And my family noticed. Dad stopped going to the barber shop because the men there talked about that Hartley woman who's doing all the good. Mom's garden club friends kept asking when I might visit again, as if I were a celebrity they could borrow glory from. Caroline's name, once spoken with admiration at every checkout line, now drew awkward silences followed by quick changes of subject to, "Have you seen what Grace is up to?" Even Tommy, who had never read anything longer than a betting slip, saw my face on the cover of a magazine at the gas station and texted me a thumbs-up emoji he immediately deleted. Their pride had always been loud, bright, brittle. Mine grew quietly, steadily, like ivy covering an old wall. And the more it grew, the smaller they appeared in its shadow. I could feel their unease across town the way you feel a storm coming in your joints. They had spent decades believing the world revolved around their version of the Hartley name. Now the world had discovered a different version, one that didn't include them at all. I kept working. I kept smiling in photographs. I kept the photograph of Lily in its silver frame where only I could see it each night. I was becoming someone new, someone the old Grace would have looked up to, someone Lily might one day be proud to meet. And that's when the knocking on my door began. The first was Dad 3 weeks after the magazine cover, standing on my porch in a windbreaker 2 sizes too big. The Hartley & Sons logo faded to a ghost on the chest. He held a manila folder like a white flag. "Grace," he started, voice cracked from disuse. "Can we talk?" "Just 5 minutes." I let him in, pointed to the kitchen table, poured coffee I knew he wouldn't drink. He slid the folder across the oak surface. Inside were liquidation notices, final demands, a sheriff's sale scheduled for the equipment yard. "I'm finished," he said, eyes on the table. "The banks won't wait. If you could loan the company just enough to cover payroll, buy me 90 days, I'll sign anything you want. The house, The land, whatever it takes. I opened the folder, flipped through the pages as if seeing them for the first time. You mean the land you already signed over to Tommy to keep it away from me? His head snapped up. That was a mistake. Temporary. I can undo it. No, I said, calm, almost kind. You taught me a long time ago that some things can't be undone. You built your empire on the belief that I would never matter enough to fight back. Live with the empire you built, Dad. He sat very still the way old men do when they finally understand the game is over. When he stood to leave, his shoulders were narrower than I remembered. Mom came 2 days later, clutching her purse like a life raft. She had lost weight. The pearls looked too heavy around her neck. I sold the good china, she whispered. The cruise money is gone. Richard says there's nothing left. Grace, please. I can't go to a home. I can't. I set a single sheet of paper in front of her. Write a letter to the editor of the Maplewood Gazette. Tell them exactly what you told me in the sunroom every time you chose silence while they hurt me. Publish it under your real name. Then I'll move 50,000 into an account only you can touch. Not before. Her pen hovered, trembling. They'll all read it. The garden club, the church. That's the point. She cried again, but this time I didn't hand her a tissue. She left with the blank page folded in her fist. Caroline arrived on a Saturday evening, makeup flawless, voice brittle. She stood in my living room as if the furniture might bite her. They're saying I embezzled commissions, she said. It isn't true, but the rumor is everywhere. You know these people. One word from you at the foundation gala and they'll listen. I offered her tea. She refused. I can make one phone call, I said. Or you can host a women's luncheon next month, announce that every cent of the proceeds will go to the Lily Margaret Foundation, and introduce me as the keynote speaker. You'll stand at the podium and tell 300 women why you're proud to support what I've built. Then I'll correct the record. Her laugh was sharp. You want me to grovel in front of everyone who used to envy me? I want you to choose. She left furious tires spitting gravel. Within 48 hours, the rumors mutated. Grace Hartley was jealous, vindictive, using her new money to destroy her own sister. Anonymous accounts bloomed on local Facebook pages, screenshots of old family photos with cruel captions. I waited until the noise peaked, then uploaded a single 30-second clip to every group. Caroline in my living room, voice clear, demanding I fix her reputation in exchange for nothing. The timestamp glowed in the corner. The comments reversed overnight. By morning, her phone had gone silent again, permanently this time. 3 knocks, 3 refusals, 3 lessons they finally felt in their bones. They thought they could defeat me again, but this time I was ready. They thought they could defeat me again, but this time I was ready. I sent the invitations on heavy cream cardstock gold foil. Border my new monogram at the top. An intimate family dinner to celebrate new beginnings. It read, Saturday, 7 o'clock, black tie, optional. I signed each one by hand. Grace, Margaret Hartley, chairwoman. Lily, Margaret Foundation. They all answered yes within hours. Desperation makes people punctual. I rented the entire private dining room at the old Riverside Inn, the one with the crystal chandeliers, and the long mahogany table that seats exactly 12. White linens, candlelight, roses the color of fresh blood. The menu was almost identical to that October night: roast beef, rosemary potatoes, Yorkshire pudding, apple pie for dessert. I even had the chef use the same china pattern Mom had once bragged was irreplaceable. They arrived one by one, dressed in their last good outfits. Dad in a suit that hung loose at the shoulders. Mom clutching her pearls like rosary beads. Caroline in navy silk that couldn't hide the new tightness around her mouth. Tommy trailed behind, eyes darting already, calculating exits. I greeted them at the door wearing emerald velvet and the diamond studs that had once belonged to Ellie, smiling the way hostesses do when everything is perfect. I seated Dad at the head out of habit, more than courtesy. Mom to his right, Caroline to his left, Tommy beside her. The other chairs stayed empty, silent reminders that no one else had been invited. We made it through the first course with brittle small talk about the weather and the unseasonable warmth. The second course arrived and the wine flowed and their shoulders loosened just enough. I tapped my glass with a silver spoon. The sound rang clear. I want to thank you all for coming. I began, voice warm, almost fond. This table feels familiar, doesn't it? Same food. Same faces. Only everything has changed. Dad shifted. Mom's fork paused halfway to her mouth. I pressed a small remote. The lights dimmed and a discreet screen descended from the ceiling. The recording began. Their own voices filled the room, tinny but unmistakable. It was from February, the day Mom had patted my knee and explained the new trust. Every word crystal clear, the plan to skip my generation entirely. The glee at how reasonable I had been, Caroline's smug. It's not personal, it's practical. Dad's quiet instruction to the attorney to make it ironclad in case Grace gets ideas. Mom made a small, wounded sound. Caroline's wine glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the hardwood. When the recording ended, I let the silence sit for 5 full seconds. That was Act 1, I said pleasantly. I pressed the remote again. Property records appeared, deed transfers, mortgage documents. The family home, the one they still slept in every night now, titled solely to Elm Street Holdings, LLC. A company wholly owned by me. I had purchased the note from the bank 6 weeks ago and quietly foreclosed, then paid cash at the sheriff's sale. They had never even received the notice. It went to an old P.O. box Dad forgot existed. Dad stood so fast his chair toppled. This is our home, it was, I corrected. Now it's mine. You have 30 days. Caroline found her voice. You can't just... I wasn't finished. One more click, and the screen filled with grainy home video time-stamped 34 years earlier. A much younger Richard at the same table laughing while a 24-year-old Grace me hair in a bun, eyes bright with hope, laid out detailed plans for a bookkeeping software package I had designed in night school. I remembered every slide. He had patted my hand, told me it was cute, then 6 months later announced Hartley & Sons was launching his new accounting division. The software that made him his first million had my code in every line, my name erased from every credit. The video ended on Dad raising a toast to family innovation. I turned the lights back up. Everything you have, I said quietly, was built on pieces you took from me. The company, the land, the software, the very roof over your heads. Tonight the bill comes due. Mom was crying silently. Caroline stared at her plate as if it might save her. Dad looked suddenly ancient. I lifted my glass. To clarity, I said, echoing Caroline's toast from that first night. None of them drank. I set my glass down untouched. This time I was the one who said, you don't belong here. This time I was the one who said, you don't belong here. The words hung in the candlelit air like the final chord of a song no one wanted to end. Dad's mouth opened, closed, opened again, but nothing came out. Mom stared at her plate as though the roast might offer mercy. Caroline's hands trembled so violently her bracelet rattled against the table. Only Tommy looked around for another exit that wasn't there. I let the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Then I smiled, the small, calm smile I had practiced for weeks. There is, however, one person in this bloodline who has never hurt me, I said. One person who still deserves a future untainted by the choices the rest of you made. I pressed the remote one last time. A new document appeared on the screen. My last will and testament, executed the day before, notarized in triplicate. The bulk of the Lily Margaret Foundation endowment, the Evanston commercial property, the investment accounts, everything that remained after operating expenses, and a modest annuity for my own old age was irrevocably directed to a single beneficiary, Miss Sophia Langford, age 17, currently a senior at Maplewood High School. Caroline's daughter. Caroline shot to her feet. You can't be serious. She's a child. She's the only one at this table who ever treated me like a human being, I answered. Every Christmas, she was the one who hugged me first. Every birthday, she drew me a card instead of letting the housekeeper sign one. When the rest of you forgot I existed, she still asked me to proofread her college essays. Sophia had been away at an academic camp the night of the original dinner, which was why the reversal had been staged without her. I had planned it that way. Children should never be collateral damage. Caroline's voice cracked. She's my daughter. You can't just buy her. I'm not buying her, I said. I'm freeing her. I turned to the rest of them. As of 9 o'clock this morning, I filed paperwork with the county clerk renouncing any legal kinship to Richard Hartley. Diane Hartley, Caroline Langford, and Thomas Hartley. I am no longer your daughter, your sister, or anything else. The name on my driver's license, my passport, my foundation letterhead is now legally Grace Margaret Hart. Singular. You are strangers to me in every way that matters. Dad made a strangled sound. Mom reached for him, then thought better of it. Caroline lunged forward. Sophia will never accept this. She loves me. She's loyal. The door to the private dining room opened on cue. Sophia walked in wearing the simple navy dress she had worn to her scholarship interview, hair pulled back, eyes bright and unafraid. She carried a small envelope. Actually, Mom, she said quietly, I've known for months. Caroline froze. Sophia came to stand beside me. Aunt Grace started paying for my piano lessons when I was 9. She funded every summer program, every AP course the college counselor you thought the school gave me for free. Every year on my birthday, an anonymous donor sent exactly what I needed. Last month, Aunt Grace told me who she was and why she did it. She never asked me to choose. She opened the envelope and laid 3 letters on the table. Her early acceptance to Stanford, her full-ride scholarship offer from the Lily Margaret Foundation, and a handwritten note in my own handwriting that simply read, Fly, little one. Sophia looked at her mother, her grandparents, her uncle, and her voice stayed steady. I'm not abandoning any of you. But I'm not letting you drag me down with the choices you made either. Aunt Grace gave me wings when the rest of you were busy clipping them. Caroline began to sob, harsh, ugly sounds that echoed off the crystal. Dad sank back into his chair like a man who had finally run out of fight. Mom stared at Sophia as if seeing a ghost of the daughter she once had. I placed my hand on Sophia's shoulder. You'll never have to choose between love and survival again, I told her. Then I looked at the others one by one. I didn't take revenge on a child. That's where we differ. I didn't take revenge on a child. That's where we differ. The dining room emptied quickly after that. Chairs, scraped heels, clicked doors closed with the soft finality of a coffin lid. I stayed behind with Sophia long enough to watch the candles burn low, then drove her home myself because she asked me to. She held my hand across the console the whole way, a small, steady warmth that felt like the first honest thing anyone in that bloodline had offered me in decades. When I dropped her at the little apartment she had already found for the summer, she hugged me hard and whispered, Thank you for choosing me back. I watched her walk inside before I let myself cry. 3 weeks later, on a morning so still, the air itself seemed to be listening. Another envelope arrived from Daniel Whitcomb. This one was smaller, sealed with the same wax, but the paper felt heavier, as though it carried more than ink. A single line on the outside read, For when you are truly ready, E. I took it to the back garden where the peonies were just opening, sat on the iron bench Ellie had loved when she lived with me all those years ago, and opened it with fingers that no longer shook. Grace, this is the last letter. I promised myself I would not burden you with it until the noise had quieted, and you could hear your own heart again. You asked me once the night Ben was born, and we were both too exhausted to sleep, why some people get to keep their babies and others don't. I didn't have an answer then. I have one now. Your Lily is alive, happy, and more extraordinary than either of us could have dreamed. She is a pediatric oncologist in Seattle. She spends her days saving children the way you once saved me. She has a laugh that turns heads in grocery stores, and a dog named Pickles who sleeps on her feet while she reads medical journals. She married a gentle man who builds boats in his spare time. They are expecting their first child in November, a girl they plan to name Margaret, after someone they never met, but somehow feel they know. I never told her about you. That is your story to give when and only when you choose. But I have watched her from afar, the way a gardener watches a seed she planted in secret. Every year on the day she was born, I sent flowers to the hospital where she works, no card, just lilies. She thinks it's a tradition started by a grateful patient. One day she will understand. You need to know this, Grace, when your family forced you to sign those papers when they drove you away and told you a child would ruin your life. They were wrong in ways they will never comprehend. Because of you, a terrified 19-year-old girl found the courage to keep her own son. Because you showed me kindness when the world showed me none, I had the strength to build something that let me find your daughter and make sure she never wanted for anything love could buy. Because you existed, a long chain of mothers and children are sleeping safely tonight. You were never useless. You were the beginning of everything good that followed. Burn this if you want. Keep it if you want. But please, sweet Grace, stop carrying the weight of what they told you you were. You saved a life the day you opened your door to a crying stranger. You saved dozens more by building the foundation. And you saved your own the moment you decided your story was not over. Be at peace. All my love forever, Ellie. I read it twice then, a third time letting the words settle into the places that had been hollow for 39 years. The peonies swayed in the breeze, petals loosening, drifting to the grass like soft pink snow. I thought of Lily laughing in a grocery aisle of a boat builder, rubbing her feet of a tiny girl not yet born, who would carry my mother's name without ever knowing the cruelty that once wore it. I thought of the 19-year-old girl who had stood in a hospital hallway clutching empty arms and believing she deserved nothing better. I folded the letter, slipped it into the silver frame beside Lily's photograph. And for the first time in my life, the tears that came were not laced with shame. For the first time, I forgave myself. For the first time, I forgave myself. The summer that followed was the gentlest I had ever known. I woke without dread, walked the garden without measuring my worth against anyone else's shadow, and watched the Lily Margaret Foundation grow like a living thing. We opened satellite offices in Akron and Dayton, then Columbus, then Pittsburgh. Women who had been told their useful days were over arrived with trembling hands and left with leases, signed certificates, earned bank accounts in their own names. I spoke at conferences now, not as the woman who had been broken, but as the woman who had learned how to mend. My voice no longer apologized for taking up space. The old Hartley house sold at auction in September. Dad stood on the courthouse steps in a suit that needed altering and watched strangers bid on the only kingdom he had ever ruled. The proceeds barely covered the back taxes and the second mortgage he had hidden from everyone. He and Mom moved into a one-bedroom apartment above the hardware store, where he once bought supplies by the truckload. Mom filled the tiny rooms with African violets in plastic pots and told the neighbors she preferred cozy. Dad took a part-time job greeting customers at the lumberyard, the same place that had once begged for his business. He wore an orange vest now and called people sir and ma'am with the same mouth that once declared me useless. Caroline listed her lake house for half what she paid and still waited 4 months for an offer. She moved into a 2-bedroom rental on the east side of town, the one with the peeling siding and the neighbor who played music too loud. She got her real estate license reinstated and started showing starter homes to young couples who didn't know her name used to open every door in the county. Some days she sold nothing and came home to eat cereal over the sink because pride was the only thing she had left to swallow. They unraveled the way old rope does, strand by strand, each pull loosening the next until nothing held. No one orchestrated it but themselves. I simply stepped aside and let gravity do what it had always intended. Meanwhile, the foundation flourished. We launched an online platform where women over 50 could tell their stories anonymously, and within a year it had 500,000 visitors a month. Book deals arrived then, a documentary crew, then speaking invitations from places I had only seen on maps. I flew coach because I wanted to sit beside the women who were finally taking their first trips alone. I kept Lily's photograph in my carry-on and touched it before every takeoff. A quiet promise that one day soon I would be brave enough to knock on her door. In November, 3 separate applications arrived at the foundation's intake desk. The names had been changed for privacy, but the details were unmistakable. A 79-year-old woman whose husband's business failure had left her homeless. An 81-year-old man seeking vocational training after losing everything to bad investments. A 54-year-old former socialite asking for a small business grant to restart a real estate career. All 3 wrote in nearly identical, careful handwriting that they had no family left to turn to. My assistant brought the files to me with raised eyebrows. I read them slowly, tracing the familiar loops and slants I had known since childhood. Then I signed the approval forms exactly as I signed every other Grace Margaret Hart, executive director. They would receive the same help every applicant received: housing assistance, job counseling, a chance to stand up again. No special treatment, no whispered explanations, no confrontation. Just the quiet mercy I had built for strangers extended at last to the people who had taught me what cruelty felt like. I pictured them opening the acceptance letters, seeing the Lily Margaret Foundation letterhead, realizing whose hands now decided whether they ate or slept under a roof. I wondered if they felt the same hush I once felt when someone finally chose me. I never told them I knew. Some circles close without a sound. They called me useless. And then they lived in a world built by my hands. If you've been holding your breath through every twist of Grace's story, let go now and tell me in the comments which moment hit you the hardest. Was it the recreated dinner? The revelation about her daughter Lily? Or the quiet, perfect justice of her own family, unknowingly asking the Lily Margaret Foundation for help? Drop your favorite part below because I read every single comment, and I can't wait to hear what made you cheer, cry, or stand up and applaud. This journey from invisible to unstoppable took us 16 parts and thousands of words, but it all started with one woman who decided her silence would no longer mean surrender. If Grace's transformation gave you even a spark of courage to rewrite your own story, do 3 things for me right now. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next life-changing tale. Ring the bell, so YouTube actually shows you when I post and share this series with one person who needs to remember they're never too old, too quiet, or too broken to rise. Your comments are what keep these stories alive. Tell me who in your life needs to hear that being underestimated can become the greatest superpower of all. I'll be right here reading every word, heart full ready for the next journey together. See you in the next one.